Okay, Board of Regents says no law school for Shreveport. You don't need one. We don't need one. You and Barrow Peacock sort of had filed the legislation. We want the study. This is step one. What did the study say?
Well, it said that we have
and why we don't need. And as you're explaining what was in the study, the no of the study, make your case for why we do.
Well, they basically concluded that we don't have a shortage or a need based on the fact that we have existing law schools in the state. Their contention is that we have an improper distribution of our law schools in the state. And so in their efforts to offer solutions to that, one of which was a complete non-starter, and that is to move the current Southern University Law School to Shreveport. Well, we know politically that has no ability to go anywhere. It's a non-starter. And so it also had some other suggestions about maybe you incentivize lawyers to move back to the Shreveport area, kind of like you do with some medical degree programs recently.
I'm not trying to interrupt, but I think it goes back to our previous segment. You, Senator Peacock, and others, at some point you got to feel like you're really being patronized.
Oh, absolutely, without question. I mean, this is yet again, as you've heard me over these years, offer example after example of, just pat Northwest Louisiana on the head and smile at them and pat them on the butt and send them on their way. Again, another example of simply not being treated with respect that we should be afforded as the third largest metropolitan region within this state. And in terms of making the case, I think if you just pull out a map of this region, it becomes obvious. Shreveport sits at the epicenter of one of the largest regions in the country, bounded by Dallas to the west, Little Rock to the north, Jackson to the east, and Baton Rouge to the south. That whole entire area and region does not have a law school. There are literally millions of people who are there. There are literally hundreds of lawyers and lots of people who would like to have the opportunity to access legal education, along with a broad range of other educational opportunities like engineering and other types of things that help to grow and develop an area into the kind of knowledge-based economy that we want to have in a place like Shreveport.
What are the underlying, in your mind, getting back to the patronization remark, what do you think are the reasons that the regents gave for Shreveport doesn't need a law school? Can you take what they said on the surface and accept that, or do you think there's maybe something a little more underlying and, as you and I have talked about, traditional?
Well, I think it's just simply a part of the same pattern that we find ourselves in. Several months ago, it was the dental school again.
Well, they shot that down too.
Absolutely. Shot down as well. For similar types of reasons. And again, it is, once again, we are up against history. As I pointed out, we didn't get into publicly funded higher education in this area until 1965. Yeah. And so when you look at the founding dates of other institutions across this state and across this country, they go back to the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. Nobody's coming in and saying excellence in higher education as a significant institution, except an example like the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Or University of Alabama at Huntsville, which represent the types of examples that I think we as a region should be looking to in terms of how it is that we want to hopefully at some point come up with a vision of how we configure higher education in this region of the state as we go forward and use that as a part of the mix that helps us build an economy for the 21st century.
So knowing you the way I do, and we've known each other a long time, you're easily discouraged. I know you're just going to throw up your hands and say, the hell with it all, right?
Not at all.
Or do I misread?
You misread again.
So what do we do now? What's the plan?
Well, we will.
Let me add one more caveat to that. Mm-hmm. Is what's the plan, and is part of our failure, perhaps too strong a word, but you know what I mean, is part of our inability to make stuff like this work, is it a lack of unity among legislators from this area?
Well, it is not necessarily a lack of unity. It is the fact that you have competing agendas. For instance, when you talk about LSU Shreveport or you talk about Louisiana Tech, there's institutions that are within separate systems. LSU Shreveport is a part of the flagship campus out of Baton Rouge. Louisiana Tech is a part of the University of Louisiana system.
Here I am interrupting again, and there's just so much. Is part of the problem is that not only is it South Louisiana with half the population or more, sort of anti-North, but is it also the way that the system is set up that I don't want to say to screw Shreveport, but you know what I mean.
Well, if you go back and look at how we entered into publicly funded higher education from the very beginning, we ended up doing it in a way that set us up for challenges going forward. In that, racism, race segregation was still the law of the land at that time. So rather than coming up with one good comprehensive concept of a University of Shreveport, we ended up with Southern University Shreveport. That's for black people. We ended up with LSU Shreveport. That's for white people. We end up with 13 and 14 grades over in Bossier. That's for the Bossier people. And so we've already got this split set of institutions that we're trying to develop in the mid-60s and have it function as our means of being able to fulfill the needs and challenges of higher education as a whole. So we're already competing against ourselves for various reasons right from the start. And so we're still dealing with not only the legacy of having delayed our entry into publicly funded higher education from the beginning, but how it is that we managed to start that effort as separate, competing, non-aligned efforts from the beginning.
If you sort of knew that the regents were going to say no from the beginning, and it's the same regents, it's the same bunch of people that said, how do you get them to say yes? What is that process? If they said no, if you know that they are, bluntly speaking, biased against this region of the state, and it's the same bunch of guys, men and women, whoever it happens to be, how do you make the case? How do you convince them?
Well, it's
you said I'm a patient man.
Well, it's that old saying that I'm gonna lean on it till it falls. And so, yes, if you expect to make change happen, you've got to understand that, yes, it starts in certain ways and certain means.
How does your strategy change?
Well, I think part of what came out of this is that we are still pursuing the vision of the law school that we talked about. That's part of what did come out of the effort, and that is the idea of this being an evening, weekend, non-traditional program is still being explored by Southern University and will be reported back to the Board of Regents at a future meeting this year.
Do we need more powerful people in the South on our side?
Well, obviously we need all of our friends around the state to develop a greater appreciation and respect.
I guess are legislators in this part of the state not, quote unquote, working the room well enough?
Well, it's a numbers game. And there's a resource game, because when you start talking about adding new programs and coming up with funds to do things that are different than what you're doing, then people see it as a zero-sum game. So if it has the potential to harm Natchitoches or to harm Monroe or to harm Baton Rouge or New Orleans or Lafayette or Lake Charles, then those folks are rightly concerned. And so it's all about us in this area hopefully coming up with a larger vision for what we want higher education to represent, and then collectively as a region going and trying to sell that to our friends down in Baton Rouge and throughout the rest of the state.